Yep, this is what I've been saying for years. As the doors and the windows are open, I will help people through them and we will get people out. But when things stop being legal and they close all these doors and windows, there's nothing we can do. And we've seen massive amounts of programs, immigration programs closing around the world. And, there's a fight for the exit right now. And we're seeing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars flee the shores of Canada and the United States for places that are going to respect freedom a little bit more.
But also, it's not just the other countries maybe not letting us in, but America not letting us out. One thing that nobody really talked about, but there is a form that if you want to renounce your citizenship, you need to file this form. And you can't file it from within the United States. You have to have already left to fill out the form. Now, years ago, the form was free. You just asked for the form and you got it. But several years ago, they increased the cost to $5,000. Which, is not an insignificant amount of money. There could be a lot of people that want to renounce their citizenship that don't have the $5,000, right? So they're kind of stuck. But what I started to think about when I saw that they could just arbitrarily charge you $5,000 to fill out a form, right? If they could charge $5,000, they could charge $50,000. They could charge $500,000 for that form. And therefore, they could actually make it almost impossible for people to renounce their citizenship. They're not saying you can't leave. You just have to keep paying tribute in the form of taxation, because that's the main reason that people want to renounce a U.S. citizenship. In fact, that's the only reason to get out from under the IRS, because otherwise, sure, you could keep it. You probably have very few people renouncing their British citizenship or their French citizenship or their New Zealand citizenship or their, Brazilian, because those countries don't care. If you don't live there, they don't tax you. They leave you alone. So there's no burden. But if you want to move offshore, the IRS is like, well, we don't give a damn. You got to pay taxes. You got to file all these forms and keep records. And there's also a lot of financial institutions that they find out you're a U.S. citizen, they don't even want to do business with you because of the extra burden that is placed on them for doing that by U.S. regulations. So
100%.
They can make it very difficult. And when I ran for Senate unsuccessfully, of course, back in 2010, I know you got Ron Paul as part of the summit. So his son Rand, who I know quite well, he ran that year too, and he won, and he's still a U.S. senator today. But I ran and didn't even I didn't win. I lost in the primary. I didn't even make it to the general election. But the immigration was a big issue back then, and building a wall on the southern border with Mexico was always a question that came up. And I was always opposed to the wall. And my main reason was, I said, look, a wall works both ways. Right now, we're worried about keeping keeping the Mexicans out. I'm worried about in the future that wall being used to keep Americans in. So, you got to be careful when you're building walls. There was a wall in Berlin, and it was more to keep the East Germans in than to keep the West Germans out. The West Germans didn't care about the wall. They were happy to have people come over. They weren't worried about people leaving. Nobody would go to East Germany if they had a choice. Problem was people didn't have a choice. They were stuck there.
No, 100%. With my business, we have the conversation with probably, I'd say 7 out of 10 Americans who come through my desk, whose cases come through my desk. And we're having the conversation with them about renunciation. And actually what we saw during all of the time of COVID, all of the embassies around the world postponed any application. So as you rightly said, you can't do it inside the United States. You have to go overseas. So we were seeing 3-year, 2.5, 3-year, 4-year wait times for Toronto, London, Paris, Tokyo, things like this. So we were sending people to Serbia and to all kinds of random little places overseas or in Eastern Europe and things, getting them on a plane and sending them over there just so that they could get out. And absolutely, you're right. The price of renunciation has gone up, and there really is nothing to stop them from putting it at $50,000, $500,000.
Yeah. Now, of course, they already have the exit tax too, where you have to kind of appraise all of your assets and mark them to market and just pay a capital gains tax on your unrealized gains. Which, traps a lot of wealthy people in here. Now, they could avoid that if they go to Puerto Rico. I'm already here, so I think you can get around that in Puerto Rico because the capital gains rate here is zero. So any of my unrealized capital gains, have an effective tax rate of zero. So I think I would have a zero exit tax if I were to leave.
So let's go back a little bit.
I can afford that.
Sure. Let's go back a little bit because you mentioned earlier that the target is 2% inflation. Why is the target not zero? Why do we have to have inflation? Or what is the reason they're saying that we have to have inflation?
Well, we don't. I mean, we shouldn't even be targeting it, but we should allow the free market to lower prices, and the lower the better. So falling prices are better than rising prices. So if we had a rate of -1 or -2, that's better than zero. I mean, there's no reason to think that we need prices to stay stable. I mean, stable is better than rising by 2% a year. But they've even redefined stability to mean rising 2% a year. I mean, there's nothing stable about a steady increase other than the rate of increase is stable, but the prices themselves are not stable. And, before we had a central bank, when we were on sound money, on a gold standard, prices went down. If you look at the CPI, and you can get these statistics, and you look at the CPI in 1900, and you compare it to the CPI in 1800, prices were cut in half over 100 years. So that's 100 years of falling prices. Now, they want to call that deflation or rising prices inflation. Inflation is the expansion of the money supply, and deflation is a contraction of the money supply. Prices are separate, right? Prices don't expand and contract. They go up and down. Inflation and deflation have to do with expansion and contraction. So they have to do with money supply. But there's no reason for prices to go up. Now, what the politicians try to claim is that, we need prices to go up because if prices fall, they say businesses can't survive. Well, yes, they can if their costs are also falling. What counts is margins. So you can make money in falling prices. In fact, companies make more money when prices are falling because they do more volume. Cell phone companies make more money today selling cell phones than they did 30 years ago. The price is much lower than they were 30 years ago because now they sell them to everybody. Back 30 years ago, only the rich could afford a cell phone. Now everybody can afford a cell phone because the price went down. Or they try to claim, consumers won't buy anything. If they think prices are going down, they're just going to indefinitely sit back and wait and no one's going to spend. Which again, if that was true, nobody would have a cell phone. Nobody would have a television. Nobody would have a computer. I mean, it's nonsense. People don't hold off on their consumption because they're waiting for a lower price. There's a value to today. Yes, I can wait. I can wait a year and get a lower price, but that means I have to go a year without the thing that I want. There is a time value. I want it now. If I can buy it 2% cheaper in a year, I'm not going to wait. I mean, what if I don't even live a year? I may be dead, right? So people want to buy. The only reason that people wait for a lower price to buy something is because they can't afford it. It's like, God, I'd like to buy that, but it's too expensive. I use the example when I first saw a high definition TV. I went into like a Good Guys or one of these stores. And this is probably like in the 80s or not, a long time ago. And it was like the first high def TV I'd ever seen. And I thought it was amazing. It was like looking through a window. And yeah, I wanted to buy it, but it was like $10,000. So I didn't buy it because I couldn't afford it. Right? That's why I didn't buy it. And I thought, well, one day the price will be low enough and I'll be able to buy it. But if the price had just got up from there, I could buy it now because I've made a lot of money. But a lot of people would never have bought those TVs if the price didn't go down. So where this 2% thing came from, right? And this is the evolution of it. So New Zealand went through an economic, collapse in the 80s. Too much government, too much socialism. And so they did major reforms, including of the central bank. And so the New Zealand Reserve Bank became the first central bank to have an inflation, not a target, but a benchmark of 2%. And the goal was not to have inflation at 2%. It was a ceiling. And the way it worked was the Reserve Bank was charged with making sure inflation stayed below 2%. It didn't matter how below. If it was 1%, 0.5%, or negative, as long as it was below 2%, they were good. But the minute it got to 2%, they needed to do something because they couldn't let it get above 2%. It wasn't a target, it was a ceiling. Mm-hmm. Well, later on, other central banks started talking about 2%, not as a ceiling, but as a target, meaning that if inflation was 1%, they needed to do something to push it up to 2%, which was complete nonsense. That was just a pretense in order to print money and bail out governments and prop up markets. I used to laugh, I see these press conferences with Mario Draghi, because the ECB's target was not even 2%. They kept saying our target is to be close to, but below 2%. So they didn't even want to be 2. They wanted to be like 1.99, right? 2 is too much. And so there were years where Eurozone inflation was like 1.5, like 1.6, 1.7. And so Draghi would say, yeah, we're still below 2%. So we're going to have negative interest rates. We're going to keep doing quantitative easing. So we could push inflation from 1.7 to 1.99. And it was like, what are you, serious? You're just flooding the economy with money. You're creating massive inflation to notch the rate up, like you could fine tune it. I said years ago, what's going to happen when they blow through 2%, which is what's happened. Now they're closer to 10% than 2%. What are they going to do? I said, now they're stuck. Right? I mean, they still got this massive balance sheet. They haven't done anything to shrink it. And they've raised rates, but they're only at 4%. I mean, that's not nearly enough now. I mean, they should have left well enough alone, right? When inflation was 1.7, they should have said that's close enough to 2. Let's raise rates. But it was all a pretense so that the Italian government can keep running deficits. The French government, the Spanish government, Portugal, Greece. I mean, they didn't want to force any politicians to cut spending. And that's the same thing that happened in the United States. And they still haven't cut spending. Even though the Fed has raised rates to 5%, even though the Fed is doing quantitative tightening, the deficits are over $2 trillion a year and rising. And nobody is talking about doing anything to rein them in. I mean, let alone actually doing it. They're not even talking about it. I mean, they used to talk about it and still not do anything. But now they don't even bother talking about it.